What happens when a decorated war hero becomes the nation's most wanted war criminal? When the man who charged 2 machine guns alone, the giant who saved his entire patrol from annihilation, suddenly finds himself accused of the unthinkable. You think you know courage? You think you've seen bravery? Wait until you hear what Ben Robert Smith did at Tizac. 6 feet 7 inches of pure destruction, a Victoria Cross recipient, Australia's most decorated soldier, the man the Taliban feared more than airstrikes, the operator who made American Delta Force operators question everything they thought they knew about combat. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The same hands that earned the highest military honor in the Commonwealth, those same hands are now accused of war crimes so disturbing they tore an entire nation apart. The hero became the villain. The savior became the suspect. And the truth is so much darker and more complicated than anyone wants to admit. How does a man run 70 meters through machine gun fire and live? How does he absorb bullets that should kill him and keep moving? And more importantly, what happens to a human being after 8 tours in the most brutal war of our generation? What becomes of the soul when you've been asked to be a monster to fight monsters? This isn't just another war story. This is about the price of heroism, about what we demand from our warriors and what we do to them when they come home, about the invisible line between valor and violence, and what happens when that line gets blurred beyond recognition. The Australian government tried to bury this. The media circus turned it into a spectacle, but nobody's telling you the full story. Nobody's connecting the dots between the hero of Tizac and the defendant in the courtroom. Until now. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about modern warfare, about heroes, about the men we send to fight our darkest battles. This is the untold story of Ben Robert Smith, the giant, the legend, the controversy, and the terrible truth that lies somewhere in between. The dust hadn't settled yet when the first round cracked past his helmet. Ben Robert Smith didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover like the others. Instead, he stood up, all 6 feet 7 inches of him, rising from behind the crumbling mud wall like some ancient war god materializing from the Afghan haze. The Taliban gunners in the compound ahead must have thought they were hallucinating. This wasn't how men behaved under fire. This wasn't normal. But Ben Robert Smith was never normal. The year was 2010. The place was Tizac, a dust-choked village in Kandahar province where the Taliban had dug in deep. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment patrol had walked straight into a textbook ambush. 2 heavy machine guns, Russian-made PKMs, had opened up from elevated positions, pinning the entire patrol to the ground. The crossfire was devastating. Men were screaming into radios. Dust and cordite filled the air. And every second they stayed pinned meant another second closer to complete annihilation. But what happened next would change everything. Robert Smith looked at his dying brothers and made a decision that defied every tactical manual ever written. He was going to charge, alone, across open ground, straight into the muzzles of 2 heavy machine guns that were currently shredding everything in their sector. The Americans who later read the after-action reports couldn't believe it. A Delta Force operator who reviewed the incident called it the most audacious thing he'd ever seen. A Navy SEAL commander said it was either the bravest or the stupidest move in modern warfare. Those men weren't there. They didn't see what Robert Smith saw. They didn't feel what he felt. They didn't understand that sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. He broke cover at a dead sprint. The Taliban gunners immediately shifted their fire. Tracer rounds lit up the air around him like deadly fireflies. The sound was apocalyptic. 7.62 millimeter rounds were chewing up the earth at his feet, kicking up geysers of dirt and stone. His body armor absorbed at least 3 impacts that should have dropped him. He didn't slow down. He didn't zigzag. He ran in a straight line, his M4 carbine held low, his eyes locked on the first gun position. This was just the opening move in a chess game played with lead and blood. Robert Smith had joined the SASR in 2003 during the height of the global war on terror. While American special operations were getting the headlines, the Australians were quietly building a reputation as the most savage close-quarters fighters in the coalition. They didn't wear the latest tactical gear. They didn't have the biggest budgets. What they had was something far more dangerous. A culture of absolute violence married to ice-cold discipline. The selection process alone was legendary. Prospective SASR candidates endured 3 weeks of relentless physical and psychological torture in the Australian outback. Sleep deprivation, forced marches with 100-pound packs, interrogation resistance training that left men weeping. The pass rate hovered around 15%. Those who made it through weren't just soldiers. They were weapons wrapped in human skin. But even among these elite warriors, Robert Smith stood out. At 6 feet 7 inches and 240 pounds of muscle, he looked like he'd been assembled in a laboratory specifically for war. It wasn't just his size, though. It was the way he moved. Despite his massive frame, he was eerily quiet, almost graceful. He could carry twice the ammunition load of a normal operator and still move faster through rough terrain. His teammates called him the Giant. The Taliban had other names for him, none of them complimentary, all of them terrified. His first deployment to Afghanistan came in 2006, Kazaruzgan province, a landlocked hellscape of mountains, poppy fields, and hatred. The Taliban owned the night here. Coalition forces owned precisely nothing. The SASR was inserted to change that calculus. Robert Smith was part of a small patrol tasked with hunting high-value targets in the most hostile terrain imaginable. That's when he first tasted real combat, and combat tasted him right back. The Battle of Kazaruzgan erupted on a scorching afternoon in June 2006. Robert Smith's patrol had been tracking a Taliban commander for 3 days when they walked into a trap. The ambush was perfectly executed. Insurgents had positioned themselves on high ground, creating overlapping fields of fire. The Australians were caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run. As his team scrambled for whatever cover they could find, Robert Smith took up a position behind a cluster of rocks. He was carrying a 7.62 millimeter sniper rifle, a precision weapon designed for careful, deliberate shots. For the next 4 hours, he turned that rifle into an instrument of systematic destruction. 1 shot, 1 kill. Over and over, the Taliban kept trying to flank the position. Robert Smith kept putting them down. When his primary ammunition started running low, he didn't panic. He moved, under fire, crawling between positions, redistributing ammunition, calling out targets. His voice on the radio was described as unnaturally calm, almost bored, as if he were commentating on a cricket match rather than fighting for his life. The psychological effect on both his teammates and the enemy was profound. If Robert Smith wasn't worried, maybe they could survive this. The air support finally arrived just as the sun was setting. Apache helicopters turned the mountainside into a moonscape. But by then, Robert Smith had already broken the back of the ambush. The body count was staggering. His actions that day earned him the Medal for Gallantry, Australia's fourth highest combat decoration. More importantly, it earned him a reputation. The word spread through the special operations community. Australia had produced something terrifying. That was just the beginning. The real test was still 4 years away. By 2010, Robert Smith had completed multiple rotations through Afghanistan. He'd seen things that would have shattered lesser men. He'd kicked in doors in compounds where children were used as human shields. He'd watched friends die from IEDs that shouldn't have been there. He'd participated in operations that would never appear in any official record. The toll was visible in his eyes. That 1,000-yard stare that marks men who've spent too long in the gray zone between civilization and savagery. He kept going back, though. 6 tours, 7 tours, 8 tours. Each time, he volunteered. Each time, his commanders asked him if he was sure. Each time, he gave the same answer. The boys need me. The patrol that got ambushed at Tizac was conducting a routine sweep through a village suspected of harboring Taliban fighters. Intelligence suggested the area was lightly defended. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. As the Australians moved through the narrow streets, the entire world exploded. 2 PKM machine guns opened up simultaneously from fortified positions. The tactical situation was a nightmare. The patrol was caught in the open with minimal cover. The machine guns had interlocking fields of fire, meaning any movement drew fire from multiple directions. Men were hit in the first 10 seconds. The patrol sergeant was shouting for a casualty report, but the noise was overwhelming. Rounds were striking so close together they sounded like a continuous roar rather than individual shots. This was the kind of ambush that annihilates units. This was the kind of situation that ends with body bags and investigations. And then Robert Smith did the impossible. He assessed the situation in seconds. The patrol couldn't stay where they were. They couldn't retreat. The only option was forward. But moving forward meant crossing 70 meters of open ground directly into prepared enemy positions. It was suicide. Everyone knew it was suicide, which is exactly why Robert Smith decided he would do it. He told his patrol commander what he was planning. The commander later said he tried to stop him. He said he ordered Robert Smith to stay down and wait for support. But Robert Smith wasn't asking for permission. He was informing him of what was about to happen. Then he stood up and started running. The first machine gun swung toward him immediately. Tracer fire converged on his position like luminous fingers reaching out to grab him. He absorbed multiple hits to his body armor. Each impact felt like being kicked by a horse. His rifle took a round that destroyed the forward grip. A ricochet off a rock opened up his cheek. Blood poured down his face, mixing with sweat and dust. He kept running. His plan was simple and insane. Draw all the fire onto himself. Force both machine gun teams to focus on the massive target sprinting toward them. Give his patrol a few precious seconds to move, to breathe, to fight back. It worked. Both PKM gunners abandoned their carefully planned sectors and started hammering away at the giant Australian who seemed to be shrugging off bullets like mosquito bites. Robert Smith covered the distance in what witnesses described as impossible time. He was moving so fast that the gunners couldn't track him properly. Their fire was always just behind him, chewing up the ground where he'd been a split second before. When he was 20 meters out, he transitioned from running to a combat slide, using his momentum to drop into a shallow depression. The Taliban gunners lost visual for maybe 2 seconds. It was all the time he needed. He came up shooting. His M4 carbine was set to full automatic. At this range, precision didn't matter. Volume of fire mattered. He put an entire magazine into the first machine gun position. The gun went silent. He transitioned to his sidearm and started moving again, angling toward the second position. The remaining PKM gunner panicked. He was supposed to be safe behind sandbags and concrete. He wasn't supposed to have an enemy soldier inside his compound. He swung the heavy machine gun around, trying to track Robert Smith at close range. Too slow. Robert Smith came around the corner and fired his pistol dry into the gunner's position. The second machine gun went silent. The entire ambush, which had seemed unstoppable 30 seconds earlier, was broken. The Taliban fighters who'd been supporting the machine guns fled. The Australian patrol, freed from the suppressing fire, swept through the compound methodically. They found weapons caches. They found bomb-making materials. They found evidence that this wasn't a random village, but a major Taliban logistics hub. But none of that mattered compared to what Robert Smith had done. An American Special Operations liaison who reviewed the helmet camera footage said it looked fake. He said no human being moves like that under fire. He said it looked like someone had edited a video game into real combat footage. But it was real. Every impossible second of it. The Victoria Cross is the highest military decoration in the British Commonwealth. It's awarded for valor in the presence of the enemy. Only 100 individuals have received it since World War II. Ben Robert Smith became one of them. The citation described his actions at Tizac as displaying conspicuous gallantry in circumstances of extreme danger. That's military bureaucrats speak for. This man did something so audacious and brave that we don't have adequate words to describe it. But there's more to this story. There's always more to the story. The Americans who worked alongside the SASR during this period tell a different version of events. Not contradictory, but deeper, darker, more complex. They describe the Australians as operating in a psychological space that most coalition forces couldn't access. While U.S. forces were bound by increasingly restrictive rules of engagement, the SASR seemed to operate in a gray zone. They didn't take many prisoners. They didn't ask many questions. They went into villages and came out with bodies. Robert Smith's reputation among the Taliban was extraordinary. Intercepted communications revealed that insurgent commanders specifically warned their fighters about the giant Australian. They described him as a demon, as something not quite human. Some fighters reportedly refused missions if they knew the SASR was operating in the area. And if they knew Robert Smith specifically was on the operation, some units simply dispersed rather than face him. This psychological dominance was cultivated deliberately. The SASR understood something that many Western forces forgot. Warfare is theater. It's not just about eliminating the enemy. It's about breaking their will to fight. Robert Smith's physical presence, his willingness to accept missions that others considered suicidal, his seemingly supernatural ability to survive and win engagements that should have ended him, all of this fed into a mythology that preceded him into battle. Mythology has a price, though, and Robert Smith was about to pay it in full. The problem with being a legend is that legends attract attention. And in the shadowy world of special operations in Afghanistan, not all attention is welcome. By 2012, Robert Smith had completed 8 combat deployments. He was the most decorated soldier in Australian military history. He was the public face of the SASR. He was everything Australia wanted in a hero: big, tough, fearless, unbeatable. Inside the SASR, though, whispers were starting. Some of his teammates began telling stories that didn't make it into the official reports. Stories about operations that went too far. about villages where every military-age male ended up neutralized, about prisoners who didn't make it back to base, about a culture within the regiment that had crossed the line from aggressive to criminal. The Australian media began investigating in 2017. What they uncovered was explosive. Allegations of war crimes, unlawful terminations, planting of weapons on deceased civilians to justify engagements, a culture of impunity within the SASR that allowed operators to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And at the center of many of these allegations was Ben Robert Smith. The man who'd charged machine gun nests was now accused of executing unarmed prisoners. The man who'd saved his patrol at Tizac was accused of forcing a handcuffed detainee off a cliff. The Victoria Cross recipient was accused of being a war criminal. The case became a legal and media circus that consumed Australian public life for years. The trial was one of the longest and most expensive in Australian history. Witnesses testified to seeing Robert Smith commit heinous acts. Other witnesses testified to his heroism and integrity. The evidence was contradictory, confusing, filtered through the fog of war and the passage of years. In 2023, a civil court ruled against Robert Smith on several key allegations. The judge found, on the balance of probabilities, that he had committed war crimes. Here's where the story gets complicated in ways that make simple narratives impossible. Afghanistan was not a normal war. It was not a war with clear enemies, clear objectives, or clear rules. Coalition forces were fighting an enemy that used children as shields, that hid among civilians, that employed tactics specifically designed to make lawful engagement impossible. The rules of engagement changed constantly. What was legal on one deployment could get you court-martialed on the next. Soldiers were expected to make split-second decisions in life-or-death situations, then have those decisions analyzed for years by lawyers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. The catch-and-release system was particularly maddening. Special operations teams would risk their lives to capture high-value Taliban commanders. They'd gather intelligence, build cases, then watch as those same commanders were released weeks later due to lack of evidence or political pressure. Some of those released fighters would return to the battlefield and harm coalition soldiers. The psychological toll of this cycle cannot be overstated. Multiple SASR operators developed severe PTSD. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Rates of self-harm among returning veterans climbed. These men had been asked to do the impossible, fight a counterinsurgency war with one hand tied behind their backs, then live with the moral weight of the compromises they'd made in the field. Some broke, some adapted. Some did things they would regret for the rest of their lives. Where does Robert Smith fit in this spectrum? That's the question Australia has been grappling with for nearly a decade. Was he a war hero who made hard decisions in an impossible situation? Was he a war criminal who used the chaos of combat to indulge violent impulses? Was he both? Can someone be both? American Special Operations veterans who worked with him are split. Some defend him absolutely. They say he was the most effective operator they ever saw. They say the allegations are politically motivated attacks on a warrior who did what needed to be done. They say the only crime Robert Smith committed was winning too effectively for the comfort of politicians back home. Others are more circumspect. They acknowledge his bravery at Tizac and Kazaruzgan. They acknowledge that he was an extraordinary soldier, but they also hint at things they saw, things that troubled them, things that suggested the SASR had developed a culture that had lost its moral bearings. They don't call him a war criminal directly, but they don't defend him unreservedly either. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. Robert Smith likely did perform acts of genuine heroism. The evidence for Tizac is overwhelming and comes from multiple independent sources. He genuinely did charge machine gun nests. He genuinely did save his patrol. He genuinely earned the Victoria Cross through actions that meet any reasonable definition of valor. He also likely did things in other operations that crossed ethical lines. The court found credible evidence that he participated in unlawful terminations. Whether those actions were intentional violations or the inevitable result of prosecuting a counterinsurgency war under impossible conditions is a question that may never be satisfactorily answered. What we can say with certainty is this: Ben Robert Smith represents the terrible paradox at the heart of modern warfare. We ask men to become monsters to fight monsters. We give them the authority and training to eliminate with extreme efficiency. We place them in environments where the normal rules of civilization don't apply. Then we're shocked when some of them can't turn it off. We're horrified when the skills we praised in the field become crimes when examined in courtrooms half a world away. The Australian Defence Force launched a comprehensive investigation into SASR conduct in Afghanistan. The Brereton report, released in 2020, found evidence of 39 unlawful terminations by 25 Australian Special Forces personnel. The report was devastating. It recommended criminal prosecutions. It recommended the revocation of unit citations. It recommended a complete cultural overhaul of the SASR. Robert Smith was not specifically named in the Brereton report, but the shadow of its findings hung over his subsequent legal battles. The SASR itself underwent massive reorganization. Operators were stood down. Investigations were launched. The regiment that had been Australia's pride became a source of national shame. But veterans of the Afghan War tell a more complex story. They describe the evolution of the conflict, how the Taliban adapted to coalition tactics, how the rules of engagement became increasingly restrictive even as the enemy became more brutal. They describe the frustration of fighting an enemy that had no rules, while being bound by regulations that sometimes seemed designed to ensure defeat rather than victory. One former SASR operator, speaking anonymously, described it like this: "We were asked to be surgical, to be precise, to separate the wolves from the sheep. But the wolves dressed like sheep. They lived among sheep. They used sheep as cover. And when we made mistakes, when we got it wrong, the consequences were catastrophic, not just for us, but for the mission, for the war effort, for Australia's reputation. That pressure, that constant knowledge that one wrong decision could destroy everything, it does things to your mind." Robert Smith carried a unique burden. He wasn't just another operator. He was the public face of the regiment. His Victoria Cross made him a national hero. He couldn't just be good. He had to be perfect. He had to embody everything Australia wanted to believe about its warriors. That kind of pressure, combined with 8 combat deployments, would crack anyone. The physical toll alone was extraordinary. Multiple injuries, scarring, hearing damage from thousands of rounds fired, potential traumatic brain injury from IED blasts. His body was a map of Australia's war in Afghanistan. Each scar a story, each wound a memory. And unlike physical wounds, psychological wounds don't heal with stitches and time. They fester, they grow, they change you in ways you don't recognize until it's too late. Let's return to the undisputed facts, though. Let's return to Tizac. Because whatever else Ben Robert Smith may have done, whatever controversies surround his later actions, what he did on that dusty afternoon in 2010 was real. The bullets were real. The danger was real. The choice to stand up and charge was real. 70 meters of open ground, 2 machine guns, sustained fire. Most men would have frozen. Most men would have perished. Robert Smith ran forward into the fire and won. Not through luck, not through divine intervention, through training, courage, and a willingness to accept the ultimate price as the cost of victory. That act, isolated from everything that came before or after, stands as one of the most remarkable displays of combat valor in modern military history. The Americans who later studied the engagement compared it to historical acts of heroism, to Audie Murphy standing alone on a burning tank destroyer, to Alvin York charging German machine gun nests in World War I, to Roy Benavidez's 6-hour battle in Vietnam. These comparisons are not hyperbole. What Robert Smith did at Tizac genuinely belongs in that pantheon of almost superhuman bravery. The tactical analysis is equally impressive. Robert Smith didn't just charge blindly. He assessed the situation, identified the critical vulnerability in the Taliban position, and exploited it with perfect timing. His movement wasn't reckless. It was calculated aggression. He used terrain features to mask his approach. He timed his sprint to coincide with a momentary lull in fire. He transitioned between weapons smoothly under stress that would paralyze most people. This is what elite training produces, not fearlessness. That's a myth. Fear is a survival mechanism. What training produces is the ability to function optimally while terrified, to make complex tactical decisions while adrenaline is screaming at you to run or freeze, to override every instinct and do the thing that looks insane but is actually the only rational option. Robert Smith had that ability to an extraordinary degree. His teammates described watching him in combat as watching someone in a different mental state. Not berserk, not out of control, but intensely focused. Like he could slow down time. Like he could see threats developing before they materialized. Some of this is natural talent. Some is experience. But most is the result of doing the same drills thousands of times until the responses become automatic. The SASR training pipeline emphasizes stress inoculation. They deliberately put candidates in scenarios designed to overwhelm their cognitive abilities. Then, they force them to perform complex tasks. Over time, the threshold for what constitutes overwhelming stress increases. What would paralyze an average person becomes just another Tuesday for an SASR operator. Robert Smith had been through this crucible and emerged harder than most. His physical gifts amplified his effectiveness. At 6 feet 7 inches, he could see over walls and obstacles that concealed threats from shorter operators. His reach allowed him to control doorways and choke points more effectively. His strength meant he could carry more ammunition, more equipment, more wounded teammates. Nature had given him the raw materials. The SASR had forged them into a weapon of extraordinary efficiency. But weapons are tools. They have no morality. They exist to serve the will of whoever wields them. And this is where the Robert Smith story becomes a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about modern warfare, about society's relationship with violence, about what we ask of our warriors, and what we owe them in return. We celebrate soldiers like Robert Smith when they win. We pin medals on their chests. We parade them through streets. We tell our children to admire them. Then, when the political winds shift, when investigations begin, when uncomfortable questions arise, we abandon them. We're shocked that the trained fighters we created might have engaged outside the narrow parameters we retroactively impose. We're horrified that men who spent years in a world of sanctioned violence might struggle to turn off that violence when they come home. This isn't a defense of war crimes. If Robert Smith committed offenses, he should be held accountable. But accountability has to include accountability for the system that created the conditions. For the politicians who started wars they couldn't finish. For the commanders who gave impossible orders. For the ROEs that changed with every rotation. For the cultural pressure to rack up body counts and capture high-value targets regardless of the moral costs. The Taliban fighters Robert Smith faced at Tizac had no such constraints. They could use any tactic, hide among any population, violate any convention. Their rules were simple: harm Westerners by any means necessary. The moral algebra of fighting such an enemy while bound by the Geneva Conventions is genuinely difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And some men, faced with that difficulty, make choices they shouldn't. Was Robert Smith one of them? The court says yes. His defenders say no. The truth is probably that he was a complicated man thrust into a complicated war and asked to be uncomplicated in his heroism. That's an impossible standard. It's also the standard we apply to everyone who wears the uniform. The legacy of Ben Robert Smith is therefore dual. On one hand, he represents the absolute peak of military effectiveness. His actions at Tizac and Kazaruzgan are textbook examples of courage under fire. They will be studied in military academies for generations. Young soldiers will hear his name and aspire to that level of excellence. His Victoria Cross is not diminished by subsequent allegations. The bullets at Tizac were just as real, regardless of what happened in other villages on other days. On the other hand, he represents the dark side of warrior culture, the potential for brutality when men are given too much power and too little oversight. The risk that the very qualities that make someone effective in combat, aggression, fearlessness, willingness to use violence, can transform into something monstrous when the controls fail. His story is a warning about what happens when special operations forces operate in the shadows for too long. American special operations communities watched the Robert Smith saga with mixed feelings. Some saw it as vindication of their own stricter accountability measures. Others saw it as a witch hunt that would inevitably come for them next. Because the uncomfortable truth is that every Western military that fought in Afghanistan has operators who did questionable things. Some were caught, some weren't. Some were heroes in one operation and alleged criminals in another. The SEALs had their own scandals. Eddie Gallagher, the allegations of misconduct by SEAL Team 6. The Army had cases of soldiers posing with deceased bodies, of unlawful terminations, of a culture that sometimes prioritized mission success over ethical conduct. The British SAS faced similar allegations. Every nation that sent special operations forces to Afghanistan grappled with the same fundamental tension: how to be lethal enough to win while remaining moral enough to deserve victory. Robert Smith's physical capabilities made him a singular figure, but his moral challenges were universal. The question of how much darkness a society can tolerate in its warriors is as old as warfare itself. Sparta wrestled with it. Rome wrestled with it. Every civilization that creates a specialized class of professional fighters eventually faces the question, what do we do with them when the fighting needs to stop? The modern answer has been therapy, reintegration programs, veteran support services. But these solutions assume that what happens in war can be neatly compartmentalized and processed. They assume that men can transition from environments of extreme violence back to civilian life through a series of well-designed interventions. The reality is messier. Some men make that transition successfully. Others don't. Some carry wounds that never heal. Some become time bombs waiting to explode. Robert Smith's post-military life was marked by struggles that his defenders attribute to PTSD and his critics attribute to character flaws. He had affairs. He had public confrontations. He sued media outlets for defamation and lost spectacularly. His marriage collapsed. His reputation collapsed. The hero became a cautionary tale. But whether that tale is about the inevitable corruption of warriors or about the abandonment of warriors by the society that created them depends entirely on who's telling it. What remains indisputable is the moment at Tizac. 70 meters of open ground, 2 machine guns, 1 man. He stood up when he could have stayed down. He ran forward when he could have run back. He absorbed bullets that should have ended him and kept moving. He broke an ambush that should have annihilated his patrol. He saved lives through an act of almost incomprehensible bravery. That moment exists independent of what came before or after. It exists as a data point in the long history of humans at war. It tells us something important about what people are capable of when everything is on the line. Not about superhuman abilities, Robert Smith bled and hurt and feared like anyone else, but about the capacity to act despite fear, to choose the hard right over the easy wrong, to subordinate self-preservation to mission success. Military historians will debate Robert Smith's legacy for decades. Some will focus on Tizac and see a hero. Others will focus on the court findings and see a criminal. The most honest assessment will acknowledge both. He was a product of his training, his time, his circumstances. He was also a human being with agency and choices. He made some good choices. He allegedly made some terrible ones. He was, in other words, a flawed human being asked to operate in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. The Australians who served with him remain deeply divided. Some speak of him with reverence, describing a leader who inspired them to be better, braver, more committed. Others speak of him with disgust, describing a bully who created a culture of impunity and violence. Both groups might be telling the truth. People are contradictory. They can be noble in one context and despicable in another. What we're left with is an incomplete picture of a complex man. The giant who charged machine guns, the soldier who accumulated more combat decorations than almost anyone in Australian history, the operator who allegedly executed prisoners, the husband who destroyed his marriage, the national hero who became a national embarrassment. All these versions of Ben Robert Smith exist simultaneously in a quantum superposition of heroism and horror. The Victoria Cross remains his. No court can take it away. It was earned with blood and risk and a willingness to accept the ultimate price. Whether his other actions diminish its meaning is a question each person must answer for themselves. Does heroism in one moment excuse criminality in another? Or does criminality in one moment negate heroism in another? Or are these the wrong questions entirely? Perhaps the right question is this: what does the story of Ben Robert Smith tell us about ourselves? About what we demand from our warriors? About how we celebrate violence when it serves our interests and condemn it when it doesn't? About the cognitive dissonance of wanting soldiers who are fighters but not too willing to fight? About the impossible standards we impose on men we've trained to break things and hurt people? There are no easy answers. There never are when the questions involve war and morality and human nature. What we have instead are facts, disputed and otherwise. A man charged a machine gun nest and survived. The same man allegedly committed war crimes. Australian society celebrated him and then condemned him. The truth of his character exists somewhere in the space between the celebration and the condemnation. For the Americans who watched the SASR operate in Afghanistan, Robert Smith represented something they both admired and feared. The Australians had a reputation for being more aggressive, less constrained, more willing to take risks that U.S. forces avoided. This made them incredibly effective. It also made them dangerous, not just to the enemy, but to themselves, to their moral frameworks, to the civilizational values they were ostensibly defending. A Delta Force operator who worked alongside the SASR described it this way: "The Aussies scared us sometimes, not because they were incompetent. They were the opposite. They were too good at violence. They seemed to enjoy it in ways that made us uncomfortable. But we also knew that if things went completely sideways, if we needed someone to pull off something impossible, we wanted them there. They'd do things we couldn't or wouldn't do. Whether that was a feature or a bug, we never quite decided." That ambivalence captures something essential about Robert Smith and the SASR more broadly. They operated in a moral gray zone that most coalition forces tried to avoid. They were effective precisely because they were willing to go places, physically and ethically, that others wouldn't. But effectiveness divorced from morality is just brutality with good tactics. The final chapter of the Ben Robert Smith story hasn't been written yet. Criminal investigations are ongoing. Appeals are possible. His reputation will continue to be debated and reassessed as new information emerges. But the core of his story, the essential tension between heroism and horror, between duty and atrocity, between the warrior we need and the warrior we can stomach, that tension is permanent. He stands as a monument to the contradictions inherent in modern warfare. We ask men to be warriors and gentlemen, fighters and humanitarians, decisive and restrained, aggressive and controlled. We train them to dehumanize the enemy and then expect them to recognize humanity. We put them in situations where split-second decisions have life or ending consequences and then spend years analyzing those decisions in climate-controlled courtrooms. Ben Robert Smith made decisions. Some were unquestionably heroic. Some were allegedly criminal. Most were probably somewhere in between. The kinds of gray choices that war forces on people who just want to survive and protect their teammates. History will render its verdict eventually. But whatever that verdict is, it won't change the fact that on a specific day in a specific place, one man stood up against impossible odds and won. That day at Tizac will outlive all the controversy. Long after the court cases are forgotten, long after the allegations have been processed and filed away, people will still tell the story of the giant Australian who charged 2 machine guns alone and lived. They'll tell it because it represents something we want to believe about human courage. That when everything is on the line, when the end is certain and retreat is reasonable, there are still people who will stand up and fight. Whether those same people can then live with what they've become is a different question entirely. Ben Robert Smith is living proof that the answer is complicated. He's a hero with blood on his hands, a warrior broken by the wars he won, a symbol of both the best and worst of military culture. He's a reminder that the line between good and evil doesn't run between people, but through them. And that war has a way of making that line very hard to see. The story of Ben Robert Smith is ultimately a tragedy. Not in the sense that everything that happened to him was undeserved. Some of it clearly was deserved. But in the classical sense, a great man brought low by the very qualities that made him great. His courage led him to volunteer for 8 tours. His effectiveness made him legendary. His willingness to embrace violence made him dangerous. And all of it, the heroism and the horror, grew from the same roots. Australia created Ben Robert Smith. The nation needed warriors to fight its wars. It selected for size and strength and aggression. It trained those qualities to a razor's edge. It deployed them to the most brutal conflict of a generation. It celebrated the results when they were convenient. And then, when the costs became clear, when the moral compromises could no longer be ignored, Australia turned on the weapon it had created. This is not unique to Australia. America did the same with Vietnam veterans. Britain did the same with Troubles-era soldiers. Every nation that wages war eventually faces this reckoning. The warriors come home changed. The society that sent them away can't or won't accommodate those changes. Conflict ensues. Sometimes it's legal. Sometimes it's just social abandonment. But it's always painful and usually destructive. What makes Robert Smith's case particularly stark is the height from which he fell. From the Victoria Cross to the courtroom, from national hero to alleged war criminal. The arc of his story mirrors the arc of the Afghanistan war itself. Initial success, growing complications, moral compromise, ultimate failure. Both the man and the mission started with noble intentions and ended in recrimination and regret. But that day at Tizac remains, uncomplicated, undeniable, a moment of pure courage that transcends politics and allegations and national soul-searching. Whatever else Ben Robert Smith is or was or will be remembered as, he was on that day unquestionably a hero. The bullets were real. The danger was real. The courage was real. Everything else is commentary.